the people who seem to be trying the most to like
Mhm.
grow and monetize, it sometimes ends up being, maybe it kind of works because clearly what they're
I don't
doing
know.
isn't like purely unproductive, but sometimes it's a little counterproductive because even if you grow it, it might mean that the way that someone engages is a little bit more shallowly because you have like a hyper clickbaity topic and a hyper clickbaity title. Yeah, more people will click on it.
Hi, Grant. First of all, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
To give the audience a little bit background, I met Grant at a dinner party. And so when Grant walked into the room, there were around 20 people just like, oh, came to him. Essentially, he's like a celebrity. And obviously, as non-nerdy person, I would not know he was essentially the Taylor Swift of the nerd world. So
I would not categorize it that way. I think that was an unusually math nerd rich event. Like that does not usually happen to me, like for context.
but you do have like 3.77 million people following you. So there's that. Just to give people a perspective on who you are. To start the show, I want to literally like read a little poetry that you wrote. Take 2 points on a circle and draw a line straight through. The space was encircled is divided into two. So you wrote this in 2015. So like what's going on? How did you started this like math poetry writing thing? And when did
Oh,
math become your thing?
I don't know. The poetry is a little bit silly. That was something I feel like there was just a couple weekends back in 2015 where I was like, oh, if I could come up with silly little rhyming couplets about like problem solving. So, like that one, the interesting part of it is that it's highlighting this pattern where you have this geometric situation and the numbers you see look like one, then two, then four, then eight, then 16. So, in your mind, you're like, obviously, these are powers of two, but it's actually not. And the next number is 31. And that, I don't know, the fact that there's a little bit of a twist to the math there kind of lines up with the idea that you have a little bit of a twist to the end of a short story or something like
Mhm.
that. So maybe subconsciously, I was like, oh, this would be fun to try to pair the idea of something vaguely literary. It's not like sophisticated poetry, right? It's sort of these like simplistic rhyming couplets, but I thought that was cute. And since I had them, and it was around the same time I was starting the channel, I think I just like threw them up on whatever website I started and I never really took them
Mhm.
down. But I wouldn't characterize that as a big part. To your original question of what got me started with just, I guess, math, outreach, and communication,
Mhm.
I'm definitely one of those people that always liked it since I was pretty little. I had a dad who was very engaged with me in terms of the learning that we would do. And I think math just kind of clicked. And through college, would enjoy doing various things where I would like give talks or try to teach in some capacity. And I just wanted to keep doing that. And I think as that was wrapping up, I had an instinct that doing that on the internet in some capacity just could not be a bad thing. You know, the internet only grows, and there's an appetite for science content that was pretty well proved at that point, and to some extent for math content, but maybe not as
Mhm.
much. So I thought, whatever the career trajectory I end up forging forward, which at that point I was thinking more traditional, get a PhD,
Mhm.
mathematician, maybe as a path to outreach, it would not hurt to have like some kind of online presence. I wasn't thinking of it as a thing that would grow big. I was thinking of it as like very niche targeted
Mhm.
things towards people who were like the same very specific kind of nerd that I was, which in hindsight I think was to its benefit because a lot of people start off whatever they're building, if they're building a company, starting a channel,
Mhm.
some creative project, they target as wide a group as they can because they're like, hey,
Mhm.
I want this to be a really big thing. So I'm going to start with like a business model that could conceivably be something that anyone in the world would want.
Mhm.
Or I'll have like a YouTube channel that's content that'll appeal to everyone.
Mhm.
But when you try to do that, you end up appealing to no one. And I think
Mhm.
it's often like the weirdly quirky things that actually gain some kind of foothold, which
Mhm.
wasn't a conscious consideration at the time. I was just
Mhm.
earnestly going at it without huge intents.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think I love what you said about you started with a niche. You had a specific group of people in mind, which is people like you who are passionate about math and like the art of math. And then it sort of like grew into like a bigger audience. I thought that was really, it is like really on point. Before we go dive in deep about how you turn it into a business, I want to learn more about you, right? So, how did you grow up? Where did you grow up? And then from the party conversation, you studied abroad in Beijing, number four middle
Beijing
school.
Sejong.
Oh my god. Yeah, I just mix like English with Chinese at the same time. What is going on? Yeah.
I grew up in Park City, Utah, which is,
Mhm,
if people know it, it's typically because they were a tourist there once or they're familiar with the Sundance Film
mhm,
Festival. It's otherwise a pretty small town, kind of nondescript. I just went to the public school that was there. There's nothing too special I would highlight about that. There were some foreign exchange things, I guess, like you said. I spent a good part of a summer in Beijing, another one in France. It's hard to know if those things like influence the later trajectory all that much,
mhm,
other than they maybe correlate positively with the kind of person who's, or the kind of environment where you have
mhm,
access to nice things, like the fact that I was like in a position to like go abroad in the summers or travel a lot because my dad was a pilot, maybe
mhm,
correlates with the fact that there was also the amount of leisure in life to be
mhm,
like ambiently thinking about math, or to have like kind of parents who would be like an active part of education as opposed
mhm,
to a passive one. So I don't know if there's any direct causality there other than
mhm.
just the kind of correlations.
Yeah. So I also met your brother. Like, is your brother
Mm.
also a scientist, or like your parents super encouraging when you guys are choosing the scientific path instead of more like of a business one or like engineering or like, I don't know, dentist?
Oh, he's much more on like the business and humanities side than I am. He's very smart and he works at like
Mhm,
a biotech company, so is like
mhm,
quite scientifically competent. But he's
mhm,
much more on the HR recruiting, growing
mhm,
the company side of things rather than hands-on engineering. I think he could have gone down that path if he wanted to, but the classic extrovert introvert divide is maybe like very well illustrated by just like contrasting the two of us. And so I
mhm,
think I was always a little bit more pensive in my own head, and he's the kind who just goes out and like meets a ton of people, and
mhm,
there's lots of good things that can come from that. And only later in life did I really appreciate that. And it ended
mhm,
up being really helpful with all things like math related and channel related,
mhm,
to realize that it's the relationships with people that actually move the needle more so than like how much knowledge about math you have or how much
mhm,
technical competence you have. I realized that strayed a little bit from your original question, but like I don't think there was anything that unusual about our parents or upbringing. Like I said, our dad was highly engaged, our mom was highly engaged, so maybe it's
mhm,
above the norm like that, but they weren't scientists or mathematicians, or like their careers don't really reflect either of ours, which seems kind of typical of millennials these days,
mhm.
that it's a very, you just sort of forge a different path.
Yeah, I'm curious. So, one thing I noticed about you while watching your videos is although you self identify as maybe like an introverted person or who is into like a very niche thing, but I feel like you're actually, in fact, very social, like in a way that you promote other people on your own channel. You collaborated with Acapella Science and you are promoting your indirect competitors YouTube channels. And I'm curious, like, first of all, how do you kind of build up these kind of industry friend circles? And obviously, working at Khan Academy, you have met, I guess, people who you started Ben Ben Blue with. Like, how did that work? And, you seems like have a close group of friends who are also in the industry, and who is on your personal board of advisors?
Well, the YouTube education community is actually quite tight. And I think it
Mhm,
starts because it feels niche at first. And at some point, it
mhm,
really was. There was probably at some point maybe only 5 people who were making a full time career out of
mhm,
being educational YouTubers. It's grown since then. But if you have that small a group of people doing something which
mhm,
is also so publicly visible, so they all know about
mhm,
each other, I think it's a good stew for getting them together and actually finding a kind of solidarity that's hard to find elsewhere. Like imagine
mhm.
if you're a doctor and there's only 5 other doctors in the world, and the first time you come across one, it's like, wow, do we have things to talk about, right?
Is the
Um,
rest of the world dying if there's only five doctors?
well, yeah, so we'll ignore the other issues that come about if there's only 5 doctors in the world. But as opposed to that, though, like the fact that it's also very publicly visible means that, I started all of this thanks to some mentorship from Minute Physics and Henry Reich, who runs that.
Mhm,
And that began just because I like watched his content and admired it. And I think
mhm,
something about being able to see the example of what you want to do makes a little bit of a difference. And something about the fact that it's educational and all about kind of improving the world in the like cheesy Silicon Valley way, but like we're trying to get it so that more people are engaged with science and mathematics and things.
mhm,
And that's such a happy-go-lucky goal that the kind of people that are in it tend to be happy-go-lucky. It's also something
mhm,
where the kind of people who are in it are necessarily likable in some capacity because they're on
mhm,
YouTube and people are like following them and like them in some capacity.
mhm,
It's not a guarantee that you're gonna like enjoy hanging out with them, but there's much higher correlation there. So a lot of my favorite people in the world end up being kind of in the same industry, which is not the same in other industries where it can be like much more competitive, or
mhm,
it can filter for a more cutthroat instinct that doesn't correlate with being likable. And the other aspect is I think it's, while it's, competitive in the sense that, if someone's watching this other math video, they're not watching mine. Education on YouTube is such a small slice of the pie that you have this anti-competitive effect where if we work with each other, it actually just grows that whole slice a little bit more, because if you have audience cross-pollination, then what you're probably doing is just getting it so that more people are aware of the more, or like channels that there are. And people want to be spending their time in an edifying way. We don't
Mhm.
like getting sucked into a rabbit hole on YouTube where 2 hours
Mhm.
later we say, oh, God, is that really what I spent my hours on? But we kind of like it
Mhm.
if it was educational. So
Mhm.
the more that like people shout each other out, that's really helpful. So a lot of
Mhm.
the growth of my channel actually was just heavily due to a few very specific shout outs from very large channels. I remember
Mm.
very keenly one moment when there's a channel called Vsauce, but it is and was one of the like biggest educational channels out there.
Mhm.
And just unsolicitedly, I had no idea he was going to do it. He like said some extremely nice things about one of my videos. And this was when I was
Mhm.
just a much smaller channel. And I don't even know how he stumbled across it, but it was one of these things where it was just like 30% growth in audience overnight kind of thing. And I looked and I was like, whoa, that does not always happen. Or like I mentioned, Henry of Minute Physics provided similar such things. A guy named Destin, who runs a channel called Smarter Every Day, also
Mhm.
gave some very kind shout outs. And little things along that, I think, instill you with a sense of wanting to pay it forward and also recognizing just how significant that can be. Which again, I have this feeling that because you run sort of a business oriented podcast, I want to like connect it to other industries and aspects of business. It's worth highlighting how unusual that is, because other times,
Mhm.
like if you are like promoting up your competitor in some way or someone doing something similar, there can be strong win-win situations, but you typically have to be a little bit more aware of exactly what the benefit will be. And it's
Mhm.
easier in the YouTube environment to do so with a pure feeling of goodwill and knowing that like the karma will come around in the long run without having to
Mhm.
specifically think through where the value add is going to happen.
That's so interesting. I feel like you have such a positive energy, and I assume probably the educational space on YouTube is less competitive than I guess the beauty or TikTok industry. I think it was really like noble and like curious. So you mentioned about like Richard Feynman in like your past interviews, and seems like he is like a inspiration. You mentioned you want to go broad instead of being into a specific, more like even niche, like deep research thing. So it seems like he is a really big inspiration of yours. And when you were, I guess, like visualizing your career for the future, who do you talk to? Who do you bounce off ideas with? And how did him or like someone else shape the way that you decided to keep moving forward with the YouTube career than a traditional path?
I don't know if there ever was like such a clear vision. I mean, even after I had started the channel, I was not
Mhm.
thinking of it as this would be the career path. At that point, I think we tend to index off of what we see in others, and the people
Mhm.
who I'd seen in math outreach, it was typically professors or mathematicians
Mhm.
who happened to do a little bit of it on the side,
Mhm.
collaborating with such and such magazine. And that seemed like a much more plausible path. Insofar as there were some people on YouTube, like the channel number
Mhm.
file existed, and I think was probably a source of inspiration because it showed that there's people who are just interested in following math. It also shows a different kind of mathematician than the stereotype typically is. This is one of the
Mhm.
big benefits of number file.
Mhm.
And so it makes it a lot easier for anyone to kind of, maybe I was sort of the stereotype because I'm just like nerdy guy who's into it, but it
Mhm.
makes it easier to sort of like put yourself in that shoes and realize, wow,
Mhm.
there's a lot of different ways to be engaged with this.
Mhm.
And moreover, if you're like putting it out online, evidently there's a career to be had in that.
Mhm.
But a lot of that was actually very fuzzy. For example, I do remember whenever I posted the first video, you get this like notification from YouTube that says like, oh, you have like 27 subscribers, people who like watched and subscribed. And in my mind, I was like, what the heck is a subscriber? Which in hindsight is so silly because like subscribers are sort of the coin of the realm on YouTube, whether or
Mhm.
not they should be. And like people end up really obsessed with like increasing their subscriber count.
Mhm.
And having started off just not even really aware that that was a thing. Like I knew that
Mhm.
channels were a thing, but I also had no notion of like, how are they making a business out of this? Is it like a one-person team behind these things or a 10-person team
Mhm.
behind these things? Like what is the amount of time that it takes to produce one of these? Like it's just total shooting in the dark, but you kind of get started trying it. As to who was an actual inspiration, I've mentioned him twice already, but it's just because it was actually the case. Henry Reich of Minute Physics, where
Mhm.
not only because he was doing really great things and showing that there was an audience for technical content, but he just took the time to give very concrete advice about like the
Mhm.
tactics of like, okay, if you wanted to do this, here's what it would take, like here's how I monetize things, in a way that's a lot more candid than I think most people would tend to be, and so that can be very helpful.
How did he link you? So like basically he found your channel. Is that the person that,
No, I
or
reached
you
out
found
to
his
him.
channel?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I
So
reached out to him.
what did you say in the email? Or like, I mean, like what's like the overall? Is it like, I'm a big fan of yours. I really want to go over my channel. Can you like help me? Or is it more like, okay,
Well,
so I don't know. Yeah.
I don't remember exactly, but I don't think that's the best way to reach out to someone cold, saying like, I'm a
Mhm.
fan, please provide something to me. So when I started the channel, I was concurrently with this side project to make like a open source math animation engine.
Mhm.
It was kind of just this coding project. It's what I was using to make visuals for the channel. There would be
Mhm.
like smarter ways to go about creating visuals for a channel if you
Mhm.
didn't also want like this as a side project. But I was thinking, I'm trying to make this tool because there's certain things I want to illustrate that are a little bit awkward in other ones. And so I think in my message to Henry, I might have said something like, I'm sort of making this. If there's any time I can like animate something for you mathematical in these ways, like let me
Mm.
know it. Or if I can like make this tool useful to you. I mean, it probably wasn't, because now that I know him better, he's just incredibly savvy doing whatever he wants and like doesn't need extra tooling outside of
Mhm.
like the Adobe suite. But
Mhm.
at the time, that was, I think, the flavor of the cold call. Is it? I was like trying to see if there was any way that I could be helpful.
Add value.
The honest answer is like there wasn't, and it was just because he was a nice guy that he responded. But still, I think that as an intent is probably the right one for someone to go into any kind of cold call with, is recognizing that you have to have a plausible narrative for what the other person's getting out of it. And
Mm.
sometimes the thing they're getting out is a sense of being a mentor, which people kind of like. You can bank on that if you want, but it's more sustainable if there's almost
Something
like
in
just
it for
anything you
them.
can actually offer. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. I feel like you are, like although you are doing a lot of things around math, but I feel like your interpersonal skill is something that like I feel like I don't know, like it really shows in your like the way that you're approaching things. So speaking of skills, what would you say is one skill that you're constantly trying to get better at? Would it be like sales skill, or would it be like a technical skill like coding?
I mean, honestly, I don't know if I'd call it a skill, but just still math. There's just like a ton I need to learn. Sometimes the rate limiting factor on new content is having a sufficient plethora of perspectives on it. I'm just not an expert in so many different things. And I think some of
Mhm.
what I do would be better with that. Like the most important thing that I can do is like find interesting topics and then write about them in a novel way. And so I don't know how to get better at that. What I guess I'm sort of constantly trying in some way. Yeah, you mentioned like sales. I don't think that's really a part of it. The benefit of the internet as it is that to a large extent, if you just make something that people actually want to consume, like it will get to them. Maybe you need to do a little bit to like push it out. But really, most people should be focusing their time on making sure that there is a reason someone would want to consume their thing rather than trying to like sell it to people in the right way. And I mean, it depends on the product. And I get that I can't make like a generalization, but more often than not, like people would do well to spend less time thinking about sales and more time thinking about product. At least if you're in like this content creation sphere. Coding, I could always be better at coding, but that one's just sort of like a fun distraction, I guess. I don't know if that's like a rate limiting factor on getting new stuff out, but I do try to like learn new things and stay in touch with that. But I'm still like pretty far below people who are like actual capable software
Mhm.
engineers, because it's pretty much individual products that I do rather than large works that are inside a massive infrastructure of code.
That's so interesting. I like that you highlight that the core skill is maybe math, and like also something that you like. I really like that when you said about focusing on the content instead of like focusing on like the distribution channel, which is what I've seen so many people have been going after, to have the distribution and then like creating something that you would like to create. And like I like that your logic of, creating better content and then the audience will come. So one of your core experience before doing YouTube channel on your own was you worked at Khan Academy. And although I opened the link of Khan Academy, the teaching link or like the coding page link, I mean, I will open the link, but yeah, I don't know. Like I personally do not understand coding or math in general, but like, I mean, I understand math, but like I'm not like an expert, especially next to you, right? So what do you think you've learned from that experience working at Khan Academy? Obviously, you made some great friends. And yeah, just curious, like, what did that teach you in terms of teaching or creating content or making a career out of both?
I think one way where it was very healthy for me to be there is I was originally thinking maybe more niche than I should have been. So,
Mm-hmm.
contrary to what I had said earlier, where it's like really nice to be extremely niche,
Mm-hmm.
make something that's extremely targeted at a very small
Mm-hmm.
number of people so you can get a foothold and you can plausibly be the best for them.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, there was a forcing function at Khan Academy to make things that were just the typical school curricula. It's like you're making lessons about the thing that someone will see in school, as opposed to the
Mm-hmm.
stuff that was getting me excited, which is like all the math that they just don't talk about in school. And where that's actually helpful is to realize that people searching for things online, sometimes it's because like they're actively trying to use it for something, or there's a reason that schools are teaching it. So rather than trying to be so against the grain and like find something that's just no one else is talking about, recognizing that there's a reason people are talking about certain things or searching for certain things, and just making sure every now and then you like actually cover that and try to do it well, that will be beneficial. So I mean, I was covering multivariable calculus content there, which is like a standard class a lot of tech majors would have to take early on in college. Later on, when I was just doing the channel stuff, I was making these things about linear algebra, which same flavor. I probably wouldn't have made that series if I hadn't been at Khan Academy. And it was definitely very good that I did in terms of people engaging deeply with the channel or growth or things like that. And then same deal, I made a series about neural networks that I probably wouldn't have if I had been really sticking hard on the, like, let's do esoteric pure math, because neural networks are not that. But it was very good that I did, partly for my own like growth and like engaging with something new, and partly because I think a lot of people ended up finding it valuable. So having that pull in the other direction was good. The other pull that it provided is that Khan style videos are things that you just really whip together quickly. You basically pretend like you're tutoring someone, you write things down as you talk, and then you hit publish. There's almost no editing. Whereas the kind of videos that I make, you could argue, are overproduced in a lot of ways. And realizing that just focusing down on what the actual goal is, which is to teach people something, I mean, it's just such a good lesson. Like there's so many ways that you can find yourself poring over some level of detail that might not actually matter, and having just a little bit of force in the direction of what if you did it in the quickest, scrappiest way. Even though I still make content kind of the way that I did, I think in subtle ways that does influence the parts that I think make more sense to go quickly or make more sense to go more casually. And again, this translates to a lot of disciplines. It's the motive behind phrases like move fast, break things, which maybe out of vogue, and like that particular phrase comes with a lot of baggage, but the intent behind it of basically saying quickly do something so that you can see whether what the aspects of are that work and like test your hypotheses. There's variants of that phrase that are in vogue and I think have some level of wisdom behind them to just try to quickly iterate and get feedback.
Yeah, I thought like your way of teaching is just so unique. Like when I first watched it, I was like, what is happening? No offense, but like I think it was just like you make it's math is definitely not boring to you, but like, math could be like really dry for some people. And like you really make it really beautiful. And I wouldn't even think of like the moving numbers, and I don't know how to describe it. It's just really beautiful, especially when you're pairing it with soothing music, and like the way that you describe something, it's just really like it's a piece of art in a way. I'm just curious, like how do you even come up with the teaching style, or is this like a popular thing in your category? Just because I've never seen something like this, and I wouldn't even imagine, I don't even know if I was watching something like a movie, or like I feel like when you really think about the content that you're creating, so it's in its own category. So I don't really know like what I was watching. So it's not really a tutorial. It's like sometimes it's like with a lot of background knowledge, and then sometimes it's like even linked to philosophy of how you think about things. For example, like the librarian farmer example, I feel like it really opens the way that I think about things. I just don't know how you do it. I'm just curious, like how do you kind of come up with the style of teaching?
I think a lot of the style ends up coming from the weirdly specific way that I'll do visuals, which is like everything is programmatically generated. And it's like you don't see my face, for example. So it's just about the math in this like very platonic realm of we're just seeing what the math is. And the fact that it's generated by a program, I think makes it something that is like a more authentic reflection of the math than if you just doodle it. There's strong benefits to doodling things. In fact, I think that actually makes it a lot more friendly in some ways. But when that's the style, it means everything that you're thinking of explaining has to be accompanied by what the visual will be. You can't just like cut to the headshot where you're talking about it and waving your hands. And I think that actually provides this forcing function to poke the holes in the parts that maybe otherwise didn't have a strongly visually compelling component to go with them. And when that's not the case, it means you should maybe restructure the explanation. And the specific example you brought up with talking about Bayes' rule and this like librarians and farmers, where you give a description of someone,
My way
that's
of
actually
describing is so terrible.
no, that's fine.
Sorry.
That one's not at all mine. That was actually just from the behavioral psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, whose work is like very famous at this point. So in that case, it was maybe just trying to draw on something that I know other people who like have read like pop science books might have like seen, and then connecting it to something that's a bit of math that we're going to learn, right? Because even if you've read Thinking Fast and Slow, you're probably not like actively learning about ways to visualize Bayes' rule while you're reading that. but maybe drawing that connection can help like tie a couple loose threads. And if someone has never read that book or like heard of Kahneman's work, then it stands well as its own example in the same way that it stood well as its own example in that book. So I think trying to find things like that where they can either stand alone to serve themselves, or for those who are kind of like in the know, it serves as a bit of connection. Those can always be very satisfying ways to put down the foundation for an explanation.
What's your creative process look like? So do you consume, let's say, 20 books per week and then like draw down the key points and like, I mean, like, how do you really make this work? How do you become you, I guess, like in that?
I
That's
wish I
another
consumed
way.
that many books per week. Math books are dense. I can
Very
read like
dense.
normal books way faster than I can read math books. But I think the best way to start a project is not to say, here's this like new thing that I'm going to start to learn. I'm going to spend like a week or two researching it, and then I will make the explanation of it. And the much better way is to just constantly trying to like learn new things. And then by the time you've started with a new topic, it's something you've had a relationship with for a really long time. So maybe it was like ambiently reading about things related to that topic for like a year or two. And so you've seen it in different contexts. You haven't like rushed the research of it. And you maybe have had enough time to stew on it that you have a little bit of an original take. And you're not just going to pattern match off of whatever resources you just like rapidly had to go through to research the thing. So the topics I often feel most proud of when I look back, it's not ones that I started to research then, but it's like the first time I had heard of the problem was like 5 years prior or something. Now, the problem is in order to do that systematically, you like play it forward and you say, well, soon you're going to run out of the things that you've already seen before and have a deep relationship with. So I don't do this enough, but I think what is the aspirational goal is to spend a meaningful chunk of the day where the only goal is to learn new things and build those kinds of relationships without a specific piece of content in mind. And for that, I really do like books. And I kind of think there's no better way than having a piece of paper or like the margin of the book where you're writing notes about it and you're like actively contributing to it, not just consuming from it, but that you're kind of offline, just like reading from an author that you trust. And if it's an author that doesn't seem that good, being comfortable just putting the book aside and finding one with an author that you like better. That I really think is the best way for me to learn.
You talk about like how you read books. I think you don't suggest people to go cover by cover, like from the beginning to the end, right? Like you suggest people to do like problems first and then like, I guess like try to solve the problem. So that's for math books, I assume. So when it comes to consuming content, your information diet, do you consume half math book and then the other half pop science book, or like what's your thing? Like how do you shape the way that you think about things? And then what's so interesting about you, it's not only your really, like I think the math and like arts are like in two different brains. How do you kind of develop the way that you think about things in both of these brains? And then like you mash up them just so beautifully. Like I don't really know how to describe the way that I'm thinking, but I just never really imagined I was looking at like a beautiful math, like it's crazy.
This, by the way, that is my goal, is that like people who don't think of math as this thing that's artistic, like recognize that it can be and recognize it can be a thing of beauty. So that you're saying that like brings me no end of joy. Two questions though, one about like information diet. It depends. It's probably roughly 50-50 in terms of consuming math books versus normal books. Not 50-50 in terms of like the number of pages consumed, because the math ones are way slower. But it depends on whether I've gotten sucked into something or not. And the other ones, it's not necessarily pop science. I think I've been kind of into reading about like the history of innovation type stuff. So like I really love the Idea Factory about Bell Labs. That was like one of my favorites that I read last year. Or The Dream Machine, which is in kind of a similar vein. And then right now I'm in the middle of one that's about like early SpaceX. And so for whatever reason, those sorts of things about organizations where like hard work and innovation happens, or like the kind of people that are like starting new technologies, that kind of is maybe the current like reading fad that I find myself in. The second question you asked, which was kind of a left brain, right brain, mixing arts and sciences. There's a lot of people that do that. And, a nice bit of evidence here is if you just talk to, let's say like a PhD student in math or physics, and you ask if they play an instrument, there is a weirdly high probability compared to the general population that they do, especially physics students for whatever reason. This connection between music and then like math and technical stuff is clearly there in terms of the kinds of people that it ends up biasing towards. And I think that's because they're both about patterns at their heart. And they both give you an advantage when you deliberately practice it or spend a lot of time with it. And you kind of have your brain abstract away the patterns. So you're not thinking about the micro details, but you can think about larger things and kind of chunk them together. Both math and music kind of have these qualities. But then music just ends up being a more artistic outlet of that. And then math, for whatever reason, ends up being perceived as more like a technical output of that. But it doesn't seem like a necessary divide. And you sort of You give someone who's into math or physics the opportunity to be artistic. And like coding does this to a large extent, and graphics
Mhm.
programming does this. Like if you want a good afternoon, just like find all of the like physics and computer science people who are into shaders and like see what they tweet about and what their
Mhm.
animations are. It's like totally beautiful, but also deeply technical. That I think just goes to show that it's not actually that unusual. And there's a lot of people with a sort of a thick corpus callosum bridging those two halves of the brain, so to speak.
Mhm. How do you develop the passion for these things when it was not that obvious to you that this could be, you're right now, like, when I think about you, you are a very popular person in the industry that's combining like math and arts. And I'm curious, like, before you become you or when you were younger, what encourages you to keep learning math? And like, how do you kind of motivate yourself to be the best at something like this?
I mean, the honest answer, if we're kind of like young, like let's say high school and earlier, I think that phase in life, there's so much that's so regimented and turned into competition that
Mhm.
that ends up being kind of a primary motivator or the way that like people think about spending their time.
Mhm.
And I probably fell into that. Like, I think my initial engaging with math was a lot less pure and it was more self-identifying as being good at it because I was getting good
Mhm.
scores on things and then wanting to be the best at it in like my
Mhm.
local domain and then wondering if I could be the best at it in a larger domain. And like all of
Mhm.
that is not the same as being genuinely interested in the subject for what it is.
Mhm.
But upon being good at it and spending a lot of time with it, you open yourself up to appreciating some really interesting things. Like as
Mhm.
soon as you're pretty savvy with like you don't have to think about algebra, right? Or you can like do calculus and you don't have to think about it. Then when you're looking at proofs, you've sidetracked the cognitive load that would usually distract you from the very beautiful part. And you can appreciate like, wow, there was a intense amount of creativity that went into coming up with some of these things. And so that's where the benefit ends up coming. And I get the impression this is a common thing where there's a pretty delayed start to when someone appreciates the creative aspect of math. It's this
Mm.
unfortunate thing where you, unlike, let's say, music or the visual arts, where before you know how to make music, you can hear music and really enjoy it. Or before you know how to
Mhm.
paint well, you can look at a painting and really like find it beautiful or be moved by it. I think it's a lot harder with math because in order to even understand what's like coming at you or to appreciate what's being
Mhm.
done, even if it takes a lot of technical competence to be able to write the music or to be able to
Mhm.
paint the painting,
Mhm.
where it becomes different is you need a certain base level to even appreciate the beauty in a proof too. And is the current system where you have this highly regimented Prussian model school system that gets people into it for like non-pure, non-passion driven reasons, but that gets them up to the level of fluency. Like, is that the best way to go about it? I'm not sure. There's probably better ways to get people appreciating the beautiful side of math at like early and earlier phases that require less
Mhm.
and less background. But that's sort of how it was for me. And it's worth the effort for anyone who can think about like showing that beauty at younger and younger levels and earlier and earlier stages to like figure out the best way to do it.
Yeah, I feel like I hear a couple things. I think one is I feel like you're a really creative person. You essentially created this math and art category, I guess. First of all, I've never seen something like this. And the second thing is like you kind of found your calling on doing something like this. At the beginning, you were trying to do, I guess, like getting your PhD and potentially, I assume, like since everyone's path is like working at Google or something, like assuming you're gonna go on like a traditional path, but you sort of like found that your audience are on YouTube and like you are trying to educate the younger people to enjoy something like this, appreciate the art of math. And I think that's really noble. But going back to the reality, right? Like when you started, how did you find product market fit? Who is your core audience? And how do you feel internally when you're looking at your friends are pursuing something so traditional, like the PhD or like the big tech company corporate route? Do you feel happy? Do you feel sad? Do you feel like you're unique? And if this YouTube thing didn't work out back in time, like what were you gonna do? What's your thought process on those?
Okay, number of questions there.
Sorry,
I no, it's
throwing
good.
so
It's
many
very good.
questions.
To the question of how do I feel when I look at other people and like other trajectories, mostly very lucky. I do think if I had done this 5 years earlier and YouTube and like Patreon and things weren't at the maturity point where they were, the weirdly specific niche thing that I was doing probably wouldn't have worked. But I do think it was to my benefit that I wasn't even asking the kind of question about like product market fit or anything like
Mhm.
that. It wasn't really on the radar that like this is going to be a thing that I form into a career. The fact that it was just these are topics that I really enjoy, a vague sense that it's good to have a presence on the internet and like an unabashed desire to do something like unique, I
Mhm.
think probably was to my advantage as opposed to trying to be strategic about its growth or anything. I don't know if that applies to others. Like maybe it actually would be better to be strategic about growth and have a plan. But like it wasn't the case for me. Looking at trends and other trajectories, usually I ended up feeling very happy because I have a lot more of a free existence in terms of choosing what I can do and tailoring it to myself than others. But in some cases, it's a totally perfect fit. Like if you want to be a researcher, you should absolutely be a PhD because that's the place where you can be an apprentice to someone who's the best in the field. And if you want to be a good software engineer, just like actually build some software. And sometimes a big company is a great place to do that. These things are not necessarily worse because they are more common. In fact, it's actually a bit of a problem the more I do try to think about a targeted audience, especially these days where because the channel has grown, where I know that there's a lot of people from very different domains who watch it. You know, people who are interested in machine learning and like computer science maybe came at it having watched the neural network series. People who are like math PhDs and just really into pure math, maybe stumbled across some things about like topology or what have you. People who were like early students and actually were trying to learn something, and it wasn't just a matter of nerding out and they saw like the linear algebra series. These are very different categories of people, and it's actually quite hard to write something that will appeal to all of them. In fact, I think it's impossible. And so what that means is that I find myself writing something and then I look at it, I'm aware that it is not good for someone that's in the audience, that it's just not the right script for a certain subset of people in the audience. That's a problem. And then I just end up like trying to rewrite it to change it, and I end up stalled a lot. And what would be much more beneficial is to kind of harken back to the times when there was no consideration of that. And effectively the only person that I would be writing for is like some sort of past version of myself. Again, this is something that I don't know if that really maps to other circumstances. Like, you know, if you're starting a company, you should absolutely think about like the audience, like who you're marketing it to specifically. You shouldn't be like, oh, I'm like marketing this product to the past version of myself. It's like, well, it doesn't exist and it's not a big market.
Oh my God.
But there's something about creative outlets where I think we enjoy consuming things that are more authentic, even if it's not as targeted towards us. Like when you're watching someone, like you're watching these videos and maybe you previously identified as a math nerd, maybe you didn't, but I have to imagine that at least part of, I don't know if you enjoyed them, but if
I enjoyed them, I enjoyed them.
Maybe part of it was less anything about the topic being tailored to you, but just like watching someone who's so unabashedly enthusiastic about something and it's like pretty authentic. There's something appealing to that. And that's this very unique thing about individual creation that does not map to other domains. Like it doesn't even map to other creative domains, like making a movie, because usually people don't really have a sense of like how authentically into a given role like the director is. It's more like the craft has to be good in and of itself, almost independent of who made it. Whereas a lot of things that are on YouTube or a lot of like independent musicians or something like that, you end up really intertwining the personality of who makes it with what the content itself is. Even on a channel like mine where it's like very non-personality driven, like I'm not on the screen, it's like ostensibly removed from like the person behind it. I think there's subtle ways that like we as like listeners and viewers kind of tune into that authenticity. So again, that's a thing worth feeling grateful for, because it's, I mean, it's sort of a win-win world if the way to make the product better is to enjoy it more, right?
I see the opposite, like because of you didn't show your face, so there's no personality. I feel like when I watched your video, I saw strong, like super strong personality. It was not like it's in a really subtle way, right? Like when I watch how you, I guess, how you appreciate math and how you really, like you said, it's really authentic to see your passion through these things, because this remind me of, you're gonna hate me after I said this, but like this remind me of ASMR, like as a category. It's like some people are just really into it. And at the beginning, I wasn't a fan of ASMR, but like when you hear people like crunching these crackers, like I don't know, I feel like it's similar to like what you're doing in a good way, right? Like because of your passion is so contagious, and even you think you don't have any personality, but I feel like it just shines through your work. And like I saw it as someone just took probably weeks to like program like a really beautiful piece of visuals. If someone don't have this amount of passion and like don't have this amount of dedication to creating a piece of art, like it reminds me of like my friends always think I'm like crazy to edit like a podcast, like audio episode for like 9 hours, and they're like, are you crazy? Just send it to someone, like, you know, it would just be like, you know, if you edit it yourself, it's like 15% better. And like I just couldn't do it just because I really wanted to make sense for the people who are listening, although my audience are obviously not as big as yours. But I don't know, like I just like I see a lot of respect. Like you said, it's just really like the passion or like how you describe something that you love, like really contagious. And I feel like as an audience, I can see through your work. Like I feel like I saw so many people on YouTube are extremely trying to monetize or trying to grow their channel, so they do lesser quality product, but I see the opposite of yours. I feel like your quality of your video from, I guess 3 years ago until like now, like it's like slightly different, but like in a better way. I feel like it speaks a lot of personality without like screaming at you in a way.
That is the goal. And I mean, you hit an interesting point. There were the people who seem to be trying the most to like
Mhm.
grow and monetize. It sometimes ends up being, maybe it kind of works because clearly what they're
I don't
doing
know.
isn't like purely unproductive, but sometimes it's a little counterproductive because even if you grow it, it might mean that the way that someone engages is a little bit more shallowly because you have like a hyper clickbaity topic and a hyper clickbaity title. Yeah, more people will click on it. But then what you don't want is for someone to not feel good after they do. And this is like a constant struggle with like in the YouTube world, the biggest form of marketing is like people thinking about their thumbnails and titles. And I for sure have like gotten sucked into just wanting to like title it in a way that I know is going to like generate more clicks in some way.
Mhm.
Usually not in like totally trashy ways, but like the most popular video on the channel is called The Hardest Problem on the Hardest Test, which is like a blatantly
Mhm.
clickbaity thing. Like there's a cost that you pay for that, which is that upon clicking it, someone sort of feels like, oh, I don't want to be the kind of person that's sucked into this, right? You're already taking someone in, having like made them feel a little bit down,
Mhm.
usually. So then you really have to make sure that it's like a nice problem that's being solved or a nice piece of content to like make them feel proud for having watched it.
Mhm.
Whereas the benefit of things that are more subtle, where you just title it in a way that like is what the content is and it's not asking to be clicked on too much, is that when someone comes into it, they're coming in with a more positive feeling of being in an in
Mhm.
group. The downside is that it's a lot harder to get people into that in the first place. So this is the constant tug and pull that people feel. And I fear that sometimes the things that you can put analytics to, like click through rate, overemphasize one component of it, but they don't at all show another. So
Mhm.
you will see that like more clickbaity things will have more click through rate. They will have higher views, and all of that will be going up. And the things that can be measured for a YouTuber will be going up. But if there's this subtle brand loss where the people who follow don't really do so wholeheartedly, or the people who are watching the
Mhm.
videos don't really feel like they're in your camp, they just feel like, oh, I'm kind of online and like going through a whole bunch of things here, then one, just you can actually do less with them. Like if you're trying to sell something to them, it'll be less effective. If you're trying to like get them to act in some way, you don't have that same influence, and you could probably measure it in some way. But in like a more broader scheme, I think like thinking about the emotion that you're leaving someone with is impossible to measure, but it actually matters a lot. And I sort of fear that the people who think really hard about growth and
Mhm.
product market fit and whatever aspect of marketing you want to talk about run the risk of underappreciating the subtle but like very meaningful and like tangible benefits that come from the other side of that coin.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I feel like similar to like, will you be implementing commercials or something into the content? I feel like those things all says something, like I feel like whenever I'm watching something, like let's say if your video in the middle, there will be a commercial and like I would definitely be distracted, but I mean, it doesn't make me switch away, but it also kind of make the brand loyalty goes like a little bit down, I guess.
I'll give you a perfect example, which is the most common way that a YouTuber will monetize their content is with like a brand integration or sponsorship where they will say like in their voice, like here's a product, you
Mhm.
should buy the product, go to this
Mhm.
link. Oftentimes that falls at the end of the videos. Sometimes they put it in the middle, but let's say we're just talking about the ones at the end.
Mhm.
This video was sponsored by so and so, all of that. There was a tendency, and I think maybe sort of still is a little bit of a push from the like agencies and from the brands to have a smoother transition to that.
Mhm.
So it's less of like this hard cut between the content has ended, a little bit of a
Mhm.
break, like 1 second break, fade to black, what have you. And then the ad begins. It seemed like there were higher rates. People would just pay more if you would smoothly transition such that it feels like it's still part of the content once you get into the
Mm.
ad portion of it. I hate those. I
Mhm.
really do not like as a viewer when I
Mhm.
get to something and someone starts a sentence and then I think it's like this conclusive statement about the really enjoyable content I was watching. And then
Mhm.
suddenly it gets to an ad because I feel a little bit tricked. Maybe I'm still going to watch their content because it was like really good video, but I come away just not feeling as great. And the thing is, they'll locally earn more money because like that can command more. But I think globally, the feeling that someone ends a piece of content with is like one of the most important feelings. We have these like behavioral economic studies that show that
Mhm.
someone's subjective experience of something in hindsight is almost entirely predicted by what the peak emotion they had during it was and what the end was. So if you like watched a movie last night and say, hey, how was the movie? Your statement there is probably going to be based on whenever you felt the most strongly during the middle of it and then however you felt at the end. So maybe there was like a really cheesy line that really broke it for you in the middle, or maybe the ending kind of fell flat. Those would be the two things, even if the rest of it was great, and vice versa. If there's like a really, really clutch scene in the middle, and then there's like a really satisfying tying the knot together at the end, even if the rest of it was okay, you would likely come away giving it very strong reviews. So with that as a fact, if the way that you're ending the content at the very end is to like merge it together with something else in a way that gives someone a worse feeling, you're giving the entire impression of the content a little bit of a worse feel. Where does that get measured, right? It's not going to get measured in terms of like the amount of money earned on that video, probably not even the number of views on that video. But the way that it would manifest is that someone's just a little bit less likely to engage with the content in the future, or a little bit less influenced by the calls to action that you have a little bit later. Whereas the ones who I think do those like end of video sponsorships quite well and actually find a lot of success in a global scheme, it's a very clear ending to the content. And then as a separate thing, like the ad begins. And I think there's just more respect that people gain for that kind of thing. So it's a classic statement that like what gets measured gets optimized, but being really aware of what the unmeasured parts are, I think can be critical for a growing channel or creator or whatever category you want to put around it.
That's deep. That's so deep. Like, I love what you said. Of what's unmeasured is, in fact, sometimes maybe even more important than what's being measured. So I'm curious, like, what's your day to day like as 3Blue1Brown? Yeah. How do you schedule your day, I guess?
Changes a lot. In usual times, there will be a couple different phases of a project. Either I'm like writing it, or I'm animating it, or I'm editing it. And the writing is this thing that like in principle should happen quickly. Lately, it's like always taken way longer than it should. And, you know, I think the best way to do that is to just be like sketching notes or trying to teach people lessons or things. But sometimes it's just like sitting down and trying to get the words out. The animating, it just feels like being not a software engineer, because it's not like responsible coding where you're like putting it in with like a larger group, but it's programming, and it's like building a little bit of a world and an infrastructure. And it's very easy to get sucked into coding work. It's way easier to like do 8 straight hours of work coding compared to like even 2 hours of writing can be exhausting. And then editing has a similar feel to coding once it's all there. And for me, it's very quick because like the scenes are all there in place. Like editing does not mean making the hard content decisions. It's almost literally just stitching things together and doing the stuff that's better in a video editor than it is programmatic and all of that. So it's a similar process. These days, this summer is like very unusual for me because I wanted to like revamp the website and add a lot of like written versions of the videos to it, and like hired a pile of interns to help with that. And so there's a lot more like management and thinking about web design and things that I'm like much more poorly suited for. I'm like tentatively experimenting with doing a podcast. So there's just like a bunch of other things that make it like quite different than what the normal times would be. But that's all kind of a temporary thing until we like get this one project out, and hopefully the website will be like filled with written content and I'll be happy with it. And then I'll kind of go back to the usual video creation vibe.
So you mentioned that you have a custom open source Python library called Manium. It's built in Manium. Okay, it's like Manium. Okay, so
Manum is what I say.
Okay, so
like mathematical animations.
So that's what you use to kind of like creating these amazing videos. How do you put something from your head to the screen? So you wrote script on like, you know, where the pie is going to move, or like by script, is that a bunch of code, or like do you script out like exactly the words that you're going to say? Because you're very articulate, so I couldn't tell if it's improv or if it's
The word script is a little bit overloaded because it can refer both to the thing that you write that you will narrate, and then also to the piece of code that will execute something. But for the first one, I do write scripts. I don't read them precisely. I view it more as this is loosely what I intend to say. It's what I'll use to inform the animations. But by the time I go to read a narration, I will happily deviate from the specific wording or even an entire paragraph if it feels like the more natural way to describe something, or after having seen how it looks, I want to just reference it in a little bit of a human way, like, oh, we jiggle this part here and what happens to that part there. All of that is very awkward to write down exactly. And you can hear it when someone speaks something that was written down exactly. The other kind of script, which is the creation of the visuals, where it becomes beneficial for it to be programmatic, is you can build a little world with some abstraction such that you're not thinking of the specific details for how each part of the screen does what it does. But you can also have this like really tight control. This is why I have it as my own tool. Like really get down to the pixel level if needed on what will be displayed and is it authentically reflecting the math. So each project ends up being you build this little world such that you have that control at the lowest level, but you have some layer of abstraction at a higher level so you don't have to actively think about it. Like, I don't know, an example would be one about like Fourier series, which has these animations where you are drawing any shape with a whole bunch of rotating vectors, each one kind of tip to tail. And it's the surprising thing that each one is just rotating at a constant rate, but collectively they draw whatever arbitrarily detailed image you want. That has to be programmed. Like you cannot make that visual in anything that's like animated in a traditional way. But you don't have to think about the specific details of each one. Once you like build the system once, then you can just plug in different shapes and have it play on it. So that ends up being the best kind of content, where you build the infrastructure and then you're just like tweaking around the rules of the world a little bit to dictate what each new scene will look like. But sometimes it's a little bit more lame than that. For just, you have to like show the equation and you want to move the symbols around in a very specific way that can't be generalized.
How long does it take you to create an episode? Like I heard it was 3 weeks or something back in time.
Well, so I mean, it depends on a lot. Like at the moment, it's actually been quite a while since I published anything, and even
Mm,
recently, it's been like very long times for each project. Part of that is because there's been other things going on. Part of it's because of like writer's block that hits in once the script is there and I like know what I want to say. It really shouldn't take more than like a week to animate each 10 minutes of content,
mhm,
if that. And then the editing tends to be pretty quick. So the long
mm,
stuff ends up being if there's like other projects at play, or the writing. Sometimes there is a project where there's a lot of coding and the
mhm.
animation takes more than that, but that typically ends up being it. So if it's like a 30-minute video, that would be like 3 weeks of animating at a good clip if I'm like really working on it all the time. But 10-minute video 1 week is probably about right.
Yeah, totally. So I can see how detailed you went through each. I don't know if it's graphics or like just the program. It was beautiful. So right now we talk about like how you feel about ads, and currently how you monetize, from my understanding, is through Patreon and maybe the merch. As a creator, like what are some ways that you think you would like to be monetized? I guess we said those two things.
Sure. Well, so I guess I'll give the answer that I often give if
Mhm,
I'm like at some cocktail party and someone's like, wait, how do you like make money as a YouTuber? Which is that it's very different depending on the different person. And so I mentioned how like sponsorships are a big one, which is a form of advertising. The other form of ads is just those that run on YouTube, like the pre-roll ads or mid-roll ads. And so I do
mhm,
run like the pre-roll ads. I turn off the mid-roll ones because I personally don't really like them. Maybe that's irrational because the other people who don't like them are probably using YouTube Premium anyway. But it makes sense to have some on there, but I just sort of don't like the viewing experience as much when they're there. In this case, it makes sense, I think, to lean on Patreon a little bit because it's such
mhm,
a positive externality kind of
mhm,
lesson, right? It's like math actually helps a lot of people do important things, and people recognize that. And it
mhm,
contrasts strongly with their own experience learning math in school. So,
mhm,
whereas, like, if you have a really great, I don't know, a really great beauty channel, right, where you're like really teaching people how to apply makeup in a really nuanced way, people don't have this strong contrast with like, wow, I wish I had been taught like that in school, because you weren't taught like that in school, and it's just a
mhm,
strictly positive experience. But with math, people have this point of contrast on like how much worse it can be, and I think that translates to being appreciative. And then when it translates to being appreciative, like
mhm,
people are kind of willing to just pay it forward and contribute to the channel. So at some point I decided, like, if I just make like a hard cut against the notion of brand integrations, but I kind of use it to say like, hey, if this matters to you, right, to have something that's a little bit cleaner, easier to show in a classroom because it's not full of ads or anything like that, then like the way we can like help this stay sustainable is with a Patreon type model. Whereas I think the more common and like probably more practical in most circumstances thing to do would be like have a blend. You mentioned merchandise. This is something that I think works particularly well for personality driven channels or ones that
mhm.
have a lot of inside jokes. I don't necessarily have a ton of those. Like people like to buy the plushy pies because they're a
Mm,
sort of mascot
the
of the
tall
channel.
and short pies. I was about to
Yeah,
go with it. Yeah.
but I don't have like a inside jokes that are on a t-shirt or something like that, whereas other
Mm,
channels can maybe get away with a lot of that. The other one that not a lot of people necessarily think about, but maybe works a little bit more for education channels, is like licensing. And so that's one where if it's actually content that's like useful in an educational sense in like
mhm,
schools in any way, there are entities out there who would be interested in like putting it in their ed tech product and like licensing it for it.
mhm,
Other creators, often like public speaking will be a part of someone's pie chart, and this is another one that varies a lot. For some people it's a really big part of it, like the channel is more this way of gaining popularity and fame such that they can command a higher like speaking rate. For other people it's like just a tiny thing.
mhm,
Speaking rates are one of those things that like it's crazy how many orders of magnitude it spans depending on like who it is or what the event is, right? Because like academic circles it's like little to nothing, and then if you're hiring like a business author to like come to your corporate event, then it's like insane. So
mhm,
figuring out if like where someone falls in that order of magnitude makes sense. But then there's other,
mhm,
sometimes like the most creative ones, or sorry, the best ones are the most creative ones, where it's a model that could only ever work for one particular channel. And so
mhm,
I think one good example of this is my friend Ben Eder. He has a channel
mhm,
about computer engineering, talking about
mhm,
how to like really understand what's going on at the heart of a computer by building the circuitry by hand on a breadboard, which is a very like accessible kind of, I don't want to say like baby electrical engineering tool, but it's like it's the way to really get your hands onto something that usually is like much smaller and you don't have direct access to. So he has these series showing how to build things, and then he just sells kits. The best way to just like get the kit and like you have all the materials you need. You don't need to like scrape it together from a bunch of different Amazon purchases. And it's a real value add to just like buy it through him compared to someone else. And that ends up being like a good business model, I think, for a channel like that really does not apply to a lot of other people because it's such a specific thing to exactly what he's doing. And so that's the ones I love, where people find like a really creative way to go at it that wasn't just pattern matching off of what others in the industry do.
So one thing is like, is your Chinese channel run by fans or is that run by you? Because you have more than 1 million followers on the Chinese
That's
channel.
yeah, it started with people bootlegging it without permission, but with good intention. And then basically there was one particular person who like got my blessing and kind of coordinated the people there to say, let's make this like the official 3Blue1Brown presence on. The website is Bilibili. There's a number of other Chinese video outlets, but that's where this one's the biggest. And yeah, it's like this community run thing that like has my blessing and such, but they've really like kind of run with it and done a very beautiful job. I don't have good enough Chinese to really appreciate this, but for my Chinese friends, I get the impression that the translations themselves actually have a lot of artistry that goes into them that like isn't just what you would get from someone trying to do a quick pass over it. So that, I mean, it's one of the beautiful illustrations of how you just try to cultivate a good audience, and like the internet will like really run with something and do things more beautiful than you could have anticipated.
Wow, are you starting a cult or something? I'm just kidding. This is totally kidding.
Yeah, this is all a long play. This is just phase one of the grand plan.
What is the future of math and teaching?
Well, I mean, those are two very
Or
different
arts.
things, I guess. So if we're talking about the future of math, like research math, one of the more interesting aspects of that is the role that proof checkers might have to play, where you can automate the process of like checking that an argument is valid. And just in like the last year, evidently, that's actually picked up quite a bit with like serious research level math. And so it's just like a different kind of tool that didn't exist before. And it'll be cool to see how that plays out. On the educational side, I don't really know what the future is, because every time someone comes in with a really inspiring vision about like how education should be, and nod along like, yeah, it should be that way, there seems to be enough institutional inertia that it doesn't really play out, at least in terms of like what the the like public schooling system of America or something, like the way that functions. I hope that there's just lots of little experiments of like all the random little schools out there that are trying different things. Like I kind of want there to be more of those, and that for more of the lessons from those to, I guess, gain attention and maybe in the really long run, like work their way into changing other systems. But slowly but surely, it seems like people really do want to change the school system in the direction of what like new things we've learned about learning seem to suggest we should do. So like Common Core would be an example of something that got a lot of criticism, but it's like pretty good in terms of the core values that it's trying to get across. And like, yeah, it takes time before the textbooks and teachers like rework the way they're doing things to reflect those values, but you still need that moment when you decide what the new set of values are and then wait for everyone else to get there. So more things like that, I think, are probably on the horizon, and almost certainly are going to follow the same pattern of after they're initiated, you're going to have a bunch of complaints about it, but then in the long run, it'll be for the better.
Yeah, I feel like it's even better that, like, honestly, I feel like I'd rather see your content thriving on YouTube and Bilibili than it become like a forced education, because like a forced education kind of almost kills the vibe, kills like the artistic creative vibe that someone get joy from watching, instead of like someone is forced to really learn about math in their class.
Well, I hope that more education ends up happening in ways that don't feel like education. And like the best way for a student to learn is to have a project of their own that they don't think of as a school project. And then they like really want to build a video game. And so they like learn the coding that they need to do that. And they're like, wow, in order to like make this thing, I need to understand this trigonometry topic. And then like they'll learn what they need to for that. Like that's kind of the best way to learn. And I don't know if it kills it for that to be an official part of school. So maybe the best way we could do things is to engender a culture where there's less time spent in school, like formal school, and there's less homework. Just give students less homework. Just acknowledge that like less will happen in actual school, but then have a lot more like either extracurricular activities that can be offered by the school for those who wouldn't find it at home, or then just use that like free time for those who do have the like extra capacity at home to like have the projects of their own if they have like the encouragement from their parents and whatnot. I don't know what the right way to balance that is necessarily, but something where it feels like it's outside of school, and having more and more of that, even if it has to be like publicly coordinated to make sure that like everyone has access, that would give me like a bit of happiness and inspiration.
Speaking of happiness and inspiration. What are some things that people may not expect about your job? From an outsider perspective, you are a content creator, you are a math teacher, you are a math artist. But what is something that like people won't see, but you're experiencing it every day? It could be good or bad or like anything that's just
Yeah.
surprising.
I guess on like the actual tactical creating the thing process, there's a lot of little problem solving that goes into like making the visuals or like deciding on how to code something. Or if even if I'm like implementing some aspect of the tool that I really have no business implementing, but I just wanted to do it for my own edification, there's just a lot of little like puzzles and things that arise along the way that never get turned into any kind of content. But maybe people think about that, but I suspect they wouldn't. I don't know. I could talk about specific examples, but it would end up taking a while. On the like outside life, I think okay, so where we met, right? This like cocktail party where we have these people who are evidently like fans of the channel. And like I said, that does not happen all that often. It's a little bit more common in like San Francisco because it's a little bit more of like a hotbed for a specific kind of nerd. I think the fact that those are actually, I hesitate to say this, there can be very bad interactions with fans where someone's just like fanboying and it's this awkward situation where they're like not really taking the hint that you're getting nothing out of it. I think that happens to like actual celebrities in a way that it usually doesn't happen to me. And like usually it's like it ends up just being a really nice icebreaker for most people where it's like, sorry, this is a very long-winded way of saying that most fan interactions are actually quite nice. I don't know if that would be expected or not, but it sort of like surprised me. The reason I hesitate to say it is that like you don't really want like a lot of unsolicited like people come like, oh, I see that you want to like engage because it is possible for it to be bad. But if it's just like a random encounter with someone at like one of these events that like isn't making a big deal out of it, but like happens to follow the channel, the fact that you immediately have a point of common interest and you can just like nerd out about math a little bit ends up making those interactions a lot less awkward than I would have imagined they would be.
That's so interesting. I feel like it's probably because of your channel are really targeting those people who love to learn. And you did a really beautiful job about creating the content. People see the effort. You have like high quality, really high quality listeners. And I feel like those really makes a huge difference. And then the way that you kind of carry yourself, it's not like really flashy or, you literally introduce yourself as a Conan O'Brien doppelganger or something. I don't know. Like just like the way that
I
you
feel
see
like that was some
things.
inside joke happening at the event by the time we arrived.
But yeah.
It's not how I would introduce myself, but
Anyway, so we're at the last 1 minute fire round for you. So first question, what's your favorite book?
ooh, I'm gonna say the Idea Lab. The Idea Factory. Maybe that's a little bit recent, and that's the only reason. And I brought it up earlier, but I'm gonna stick with that one.
Who made the biggest impact in your career?
Said it so many times already, but like it's just got to be Henry Reich.
Okay. Who would you invite to your dinner party? Is
this one of those like living or dead kind of thing, or like just people who are in the world now? Who would I bring?
Whatever. It's your party, so.
Ooh, interesting. I realize you want a quick answer, and I'm just not going to give a quick answer to that.
You can take as long as you want. I have
right,
5 hours.
There's a mathematician, Peter Schulze, who's like just one of the best in the world that I've never actually interacted with, but I would be curious to like actually sit down and get to know him in terms of like the way that he thinks about things. So that would be one. James Glick is like one of my favorite authors. In fact, I should have listed one of his books as my favorite book because that would probably be more honest. Like Chaos, for example, is absolutely great, or The Information. He would probably be a really interesting person to have like at a table. Patrick Collison would also fall in there. Just really love the way that he thinks about things. Yeah, we'll stick with that. It's a nice intimate 4-person dinner. I'll have to like think of more names. Otherwise.
Are you gonna give them like a math lesson right there? Like just teach them?
I would have Peter give us a math lesson. I don't know. Yeah, I guess each one of those would feel they're very different. So maybe that wouldn't make a great dinner party. They're just like individuals who I would like be curious to pick their brains about various things in one-on-one contexts. It's always hard to like pull up people out of the vacuum to like think about, you know what I'm saying?
What would be one thing that you want to learn from each of these 3 people?
I mean, I'd be curious from Peter Schulze what the new framing of topology that he is like working on, what the significance of that is. I'd be curious from James Glick how he researches his books, just what that process looks like, because they are very well researched in a way that like is clearly a lot more detailed and like carries a story more so than a lot of other like science writers. And from Patrick, I just would like just want to hear what he's optimistic about, because I always come away anytime I hear him describe something that he's optimistic about, 1, full of weirdly esoteric facts that justify that optimism, and 2, with a sense that like the future is going to be much better than the present. Yeah, I think something in that vein.
Yeah. Where can we find you outside of work? This is the last question.
Oh man, I got into climbing and then the pandemic happened, so I was like doing less climbing. But now I enjoy climbing. Also, I've been playing more golf lately for some reason. I'm very bad at it, but like evidently, if I was to look at my last week, like finding me on a golf course would be much more common. I don't know if that persists. And like I don't know, running and like tennis and things. Generally, like outside of work, I'm trying to be more active.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I would not imagine that, but that's good for you because I would be expecting you to, I don't know, read, coding, playing music or something.
Oh,
But
those two, yeah. I haven't been playing as much music lately, which is honestly a problem. Like it's so good for the soul.
what do you play? Like what music or what
I grew up
instrument?
playing the violin, and that was a big part of my life. But
Mhm.
here, like, I'll just grab the ones that are hanging on my wall. Which there's like a
Mhm.
guitar and a mandolin and a bass, and I'm not like good at them necessarily, but just like fiddling around on those, I think can be just whatever you grab and like come up and like make up some music. It can be like very good for the soul.
Agree. Well, thank you so much, Grant, for coming on the show today. It's so much
Thanks for
fun chatting.
having me.